Welcome to A Brief History of England, 4000 BCE to yesterday, by Robert Dees, that's me. Many economists and economic historians claim that secure private property rights were key to economic growth and Western Europe's rise to world domination. Is that true? Adam Smith and Karl Marx both used England as the model for their respective studies on capitalism because, after all, it was England that led the way in breaking free from feudalism and developing early capitalism. So let's look at England's experience. Hunter-gatherers once populated Britain. When they weren't hunting animals or each other, they started Stonehenge, except they didn't use stone. They used wooden posts. Woodhenge? It didn't last, and neither did they. About 6,000 years ago, farmers migrated all the way from the Middle East and brought their new agriculture with them. Before farmers start plowing, they like to clear the land. So that's what they did. They cleared the land of the hunter-gatherers, exterminating them. Then they finished Stonehenge using stone. More newcomers wandered in from Eurasia about 4,500 years ago with additional new technology, the wheel, and possibly also the newfangled scratch plow. Plus, out of rocks, they could coax gold and copper. They formed the copper into cute little axe heads that they used to wipe out the previous occupants and take over. This marked another major advance in Britain's economic development. They also remodeled Stonehenge. Among the dozens of little Celtic tribes living on the island when the Romans arrived were the Siluris, the Iceni, the Dumnoni, the Brigantes, and many more. The Romans called them all barbarians. They liked to make war on each other, which made the Roman conquest much easier. Roman historian Cassius Dio described them, quote, "There are two principal races of Britons, the Caledonians and the Maetae. Both tribes inhabit wild and waterless mountains and desolate and swampy plains, and possess neither walls, cities, nor tilled fields, but live on their flocks, wild game, and certain fruits. They dwell in tents, naked and unshod, possess their women in common, and in common rear all the offspring. Their former rule is democratic, for the most part, and they are very fond of plundering. They can endure hunger and cold and any kind of hardship, for they plunge into the swamps and exist there for many days, with only their heads above water. And in the forest they support themselves upon bark and roots." Herodian wrote, "Most of the regions of Britain are marshy, since they are flooded continually by tides of the ocean. The barbarians are accustomed to swimming or wading through these waist-deep marsh pools. Since they go about naked, they are unconcerned about muddying their bodies. Strangers to clothing, the Britons wear ornaments of iron at their waists and throats. Considering iron a symbol of wealth, they value this metal as other barbarians value gold. They tattoo their bodies with colored designs and drawings of all kinds of animals. For this reason, they do not wear clothes, which would conceal the decorations on their bodies. Extremely savage and warlike, they are armed only with a spear and a narrow shield, plus a sword that hangs suspended by a belt from their otherwise naked bodies. Julius Caesar noted that all the Britons tattoo themselves with woad, which produces a blue color, and this makes them look all the more horrible in battle." End quote. Clearly, these barbarians were in need of civilizing, a service the Romans were happy to provide. This was done not with the poetry of Virgil nor the prose of Cicero, but using the Roman tried and true 5-point program for developing their provinces: rape, pillage, plunder, enslavement, and bribery. The first step was to steal the whole island and the people's freedom. Once they had reduced the Aborigines to slavery, the Romans relieved them of their iron, tin, lead, copper, silver, and gold. The Roman historian Tacitus explained, quote, "The Britons themselves readily submit to the levy, the tribute, and other obligations of empire, provided there is no abuse, that they bitterly resent." End quote. Tacitus praised his father-in-law, Agricola, because, while he was governor of Britain, unlike so many other provincial governors, he did not squander his time in debauchery, but diligently applied himself to his duty of slaughtering and enslaving the natives. Roman swords sliced through not only muscle and bone, but also the clan ties that organized and held back these primitive peoples. Leading them from tribal freedom to slavery was an important step in their development. But this was accomplished not by respecting personal property or any other rights, but by their total destruction. Britain was only one of 40 Roman provinces, but fully 1/8 of the Roman army was stationed there, trying to pacify its truculent peoples. In 197 CE, the Emperor Septimus Severus sacked the Parthian capital of Ctesiphon and enslaved 100,000 people. A few years later, he came to personally supervise the education of the primitives of Britain, giving his troops the following order. Quote, "Let no one escape sheer destruction. No one, our hands, not even the babe in the womb of the mother, if it be male, let it nevertheless not escape sheer destruction." One Briton at the time itemized the benefits that Roman civilization brought. Quote, "Our children and kinsmen, by nature's law, we love above all else. These are torn from us by conscription to slave in other lands. Our wives and sisters, even if they are not raped by Roman enemies, are seduced by them in the guise of guests and friends. Our goods and fortunes are ground down to pay tribute, our land and harvest to supply grain, our bodies and hands to build roads through woods and swamps, all under the blows and insults. Slaves who are born into slavery are sold only once, and are moreover maintained by their masters. Britannia daily buys her own enslavement, daily feeds her enslavers." End quote. Despite the Romans' strenuous efforts, these backward Britons just could not be made to appreciate the benefits that Roman slavery offered. Worst of all were those savages in the mountainous north who were truly hopeless. It became necessary simply to wall them off, to protect the civilized slaveholders from them. The Romans also provided credit to help the Britons develop their economy. The Stoic philosopher Seneca the Younger became one of the richest men in Rome as a notorious loan shark and flattering toady for the psychopathic emperor Nero. Cassius Dio explained that the Boudica uprising in Britain was provoked in part when Seneca, quote, "in the hope of receiving a good rate of interest, had lent the islanders 40 million sesterces, a Roman coin, that they did not want, and had afterwards called in this loan all at once, and had resorted to severe measures in exacting it." End quote. There were benefits to being a toady to the emperor. Roman officials, acting as collection agents for Seneca, pillaged the Iceni king's realm and household, quote, "as if they were spoils of war." His widow Boudica was flogged and his daughters raped. All the leading Iceni tribespeople were divested of their ancestral property, and the king's relatives were dealt with as slaves. Britons make no distinction of sex in the appointment of leaders. End quote. The outraged Boudica raised an army in rebellion, defeated the first legion sent against her, captured the Roman settlement of Londinium, later London, and massacred 70,000 Romans and their local collaborators. Tacitus reported that, in the course of suppressing the rebellion, the Roman governor, quote, "slaughtered almost the entire nation." But it wasn't all violence. The Romans were very skilled at buying off the local elites and having them assist in fleecing their own kinsmen. Tacitus explained Agricola's approach, quote, to induce a people hitherto scattered, uncivilized, and therefore prone to fight, to grow pleasurably inured to peace and ease. Agricola encouraged individuals and assisted communities to build temples, public squares, and proper houses. He praised the keen and scolded the slack, and competition for honor worked as well as compulsion. Furthermore, he trained the sons of the leading men in the liberal arts. The result was that in place of distaste for the Latin language came a passion to command it. In the same way, our national dress came into favor, and the toga was everywhere to be seen. And so they strayed into the enticements of vice, porticos, baths, and sumptuous banquets. In their innocence, they called this civilization, when in fact it was part of their enslavement. The power of the early Roman army in Italy came from free small farmers who supported the Roman Republic with their taxes, toughness, blood, and conviction that through class struggles they had won some rights and a stake in society. The rulers of Rome thanked them for their noble sacrifice by sending them to their deaths in centuries of war, or by graciously loaning them money and foreclosing on their farms. The new large landowners then replaced these valiant farmers with slaves captured in battle. Theft of the smallholders' farms greatly enhanced the private property of the large landowners, but destroyed the property rights of the smallholders, the tax base, and the source of recruits for the army. Thus, this respect for the private property rights of the wealthy and contempt for those of the peasants crippled the empire, which ran short of farmer-soldier taxpayers. But the ingenious Romans had a solution: hire barbarians to fight the barbarians. That did not end well. One fine day, the barbarians decided they really didn't need the Romans anymore. The Celtic Britons, quote, expelled the imperial magistrates and organized their own defense, end quote. To get rid of the Romans, the Britons used much the same method that they had learned from their Roman civilizers: unspeakable violence. The property rights of the Roman estate and slaveholders were annihilated with fire and sword. Roman rule and civilization were torn out root and branch with such fury and hatred that the Britons sank back into a primordial existence. The nice cities that the Roman slaves had built for them were abandoned and fell into ruin. The natives slunk back into their swamps. But the Romans did leave behind some 10,000 miles of roads, which was most helpful, as the Britons had no clue how to build roads or much of anything else for that matter. They threw off the yoke of Christianity with which the Romans had tried and failed to teach them obedience, and returned to their pagan ways. They forgot how to read and write, to use the pottery wheel and kiln, and all but abandoned building with stone. Centuries later, they had to beg the Irish, to reteach them how to read and write. Oh, God. The Romans' greatest contribution with their swords was to chop away the tribal divisions among these peoples and unite them in common hatred against the invaders. Obliterating the Romans' venerated property rights over their slaves and estates, stealing it all back, and collapsing into a prehistoric level of culture was the next great advance in Britain's economic progress. No sooner had the Celtic warriors rid themselves of the Romans around 410 CE than two new gangs of thieves arrived from Germany, the Angles and the Saxons. So savage was the encounter between the Germans and the Celts that only about a dozen Celtic words entered the Anglo-Saxon language during this period. There wasn't a lot of social mixing, apparently. The newcomers wiped out the men, taking the women and most of the land, while they were at it. The Germans brought with them more advanced agricultural techniques and weapons, stimulating the island's economic development through slaughter and expropriation. The Anglo-Saxons were a quarrelsome lot, establishing many little kingdoms, often the size of a county or less. Each was based on the solemn principle of protecting the property rights of its king while stealing from all the others. Although killing one's own king and swiping his crown was also very popular. This infighting all but begged Viking plunderers to invade time and again, snatching and settling whole chunks of Britain. The Vikings made several useful contributions to England's development. When they arrived, starting in 793, the lords and monks of England were seated most comfortably on the backs of the farmers. Not so comfortable for the farmers. First, the Vikings occupied almost all of England and massacred loads of lords and even more monks, which took a tremendous weight off the backs of the farmers, who put their unexpected freedom to good use and made important advances in agricultural technique. These lords and monks had been so successful in amassing their private property that virtually all the silver coin of the land was locked up in their treasuries, choking off trade and commerce. The great marketplace of London was in decline. The Vikings' second great contribution was to plunder the forts and monasteries, smash open the strong boxes, and roaring drunk, fling the silver to the four corners of the land, where it provided the cash for the coming economic upturn powered by the farmers' increased production. The Vikings also helped reduce the infighting among the Anglo-Saxon kinglets by killing them all, save one, Alfred, but more on him later. Finally, in 1066, the Duke of Normandy, Guillaume the Conqueror, put a stop to this free-for-all by filching the whole island. He and his pack of bandits robbed the Anglo-Saxon aristocrats of their hard-stolen wealth and their divine right to a life of idle bickering. And these were the lucky ones. Norman swords relieved others of their heads, arms, and legs, as the Bayeux Tapestry luridly depicts. King Harold's reign ended abruptly when he took an arrow through the eye. The lands and women of the Anglo-Saxon lords were stolen and handed over to friends of Guillaume. In passing, Guillaume transformed the Anglo-Saxon squabblers into the English. Now, the English don't like to dwell on the fact that this essential contribution to their development was imposed upon them by a Frenchie, so they much prefer you call him William. Like the Romans, he too had an economic program. Quote, "I attacked the English like a lion. I ordered their houses and corn with all their belongings to be burnt without exception, and large herds of cattle and beasts of burden to be destroyed wherever they were found. It was there I took revenge on masses of people by subjecting them to a cruel famine, and by doing so, alas, I became the murderer of many thousands of that fine race." End quote. When William stole something, he was very thorough. Now, every square inch of England belonged to one king, him, which he parceled out under feudal tenure to his favorites. Technically, the British monarch still owns the whole island, but the kings and queens of England have been very careful about asserting their divine rights ever since Charles I got his head chopped off for doing so just a tad too energetically. William's colossal theft and butchery was a tremendous boost for the economic and political advantage of England, as it finally united the country, something the Anglo-Saxons had been incapable of doing in 650 years of infighting. But William didn't even stick around. Job done. He went back to France. Things then settled down for a while, as the new Norman aristocrats and church lords increased their sacred property rights by robbing the farmers. They called this rent. But farmers can get ornery toward freeloaders who pilfer the fruit of their hard work. So to facilitate this thievery, the lords also stole the farmers' freedom, reducing them to the semi-slave condition of serfs. They baptized this God's will. But they could never shear the farmers of enough to maintain themselves in the manner they believed was their due. So they regularly crossed the channel to steal from the French. They called this honor. In strict accordance with the right of absolute monarchs to do whatever they damn well please, William and his successors established the royal tradition of afforestation. This is a fancy word for the king stealing land, not just from the peasants, which was of course the natural order of things, but even from barons and bishops, who found this most vexing. King John, besides swiping forests, also sucked England completely dry to raise a great army to snatch as much of France as he could, which turned out to be none, as he was defeated and lost everything twice. Back home, some English barons decided this was the perfect opportunity to kick the king while he was down. In 1215, this gang of robber barons, with force and violence, stole from King John a whole slew of powers that God and Norman swords had granted him for governing and plundering his subjects. Civil war broke out. The barons further humiliated the king, strong-arming him into accepting a document pretending that this theft was legitimate and permanent, granting them liberties. The moment the king escaped the grasp of these thieves, he denounced this coerced outrage, but it was too late. The virus of liberties was loose. The barons and church bigwigs assumed that this first document, with its big name, Magna Carta, really applied only to them. However, the thick-headed farmers could not be made to understand this. Just because they had done most of the fighting in the war, they imagined that this business of rights was a fine idea and should apply to them as well, in their own forest charter. Huh. The forest charter and its accompanying Magna Carta brought peace to the land for about 30 years. Then another revolution broke out. Then, in 1283, Wales was finally joined together with England by Edward I's armies crushing the property rights of the Welsh nobles. You've heard of chivalry? Not here. Edward had the last Celtic Prince of Wales drawn, hanged, disemboweled, quartered, and his head sent back to the Tower of London. The feudal lord's success in squeezing every grain of wheat from the peasants caused famine in 1258 and several more between 1293 and 1318. The resulting long-term, widespread, profound malnutrition invited in the bubonic plague, which wiped out 1/3 to 1/2 the population. Lazy peasants. Many English lords, now short on peasants to squeeze, decided instead to go rob France for the next 100 years. Being in France, however, made it difficult to keep an eye on their surviving serfs who ran away. When these formerly naked, tattooed barbarians finally figured out how to do commerce and trade, they discovered that the Jews already knew how, and they were fully clothed. Around this time, the economy pitched into serious decline. because of the greed of the lords. Now, ruling classes never want to take the rap for their own crimes. They'd much rather find scapegoats to blame. So, the English lords took a break from hacking at each other to eliminate the competition. In 1290, virtually the entire Jewish population was expelled from England and their property stolen. This was especially popular among indebted landowners. It did not stop the downturn. As a backward country, England's job was to provide wool to the advanced Holland, whose skilled textile workers transformed it into the highest quality cloth. So England engaged in a little intellectual property theft. They borrowed the new spinning wheel, the fulling mill, and some Dutch textile workers to teach them how to use them. The next thing you know, the English dominated not only textiles, but also the high seas, where they used not contracts, but cannon to snatch the rest of the Dutchman's empire from them as well. Then Edward II revived the royal tradition of stealing forests, and another civil war broke out in 1321. In the process of settling this solemn constitutional matter, both sides swiped land and castles from each other and assassinated the other side's supporters. Edward's queen ran off with one of the barons, who illegally deposed and imprisoned the king, who soon suffered a most unfortunate death. Criminal rebellion, adultery, dethroning, and regicide did have a salutary effect, however, of discouraging future monarchs from stealing forests. It did not end the fighting, however. In fact, jolly old England fought civil wars in 1135 to 53, 18 years, 1173 to 74, 1215 to 17, 1258 to 69, 9 years, 1321 to 22, 1326 to 27, 1381, several between 1455 and 87 for 32 years, 1642 to 51, 9 years, and 2 coups d'etats in 1688. And this doesn't include its many foreign wars. Busy place. Unfortunately, the Magna Carta was a total failure. At least until it was lifted out of the mud of the battlefield and onto the strong shoulders of a second document, the Forest Charter. For the next couple of centuries, this second document was the more important because it actually did grant the little people a few tidbits. This only encouraged the uppity farmers to steal right back from the secular and church lords the property rights that God had granted the lords over the farmers' persons. Serfdom. The farmers first tried to do this with one grand heist, the Peasants' Revolt of 1381. On that occasion, however, law and order and God's will prevailed, applied by the swords and lances of armored knights, and the rebellious peasants were slaughtered back into their natural condition. The king, the barons, and the bishops had their differences, but on the matter of crushing farmers, they sang in perfect harmony. So, in the dark of night, the serfs, one at a time or in small groups, pilfered the lord's property rights over their persons by running away. The individual petty larceny, carried out thousands of times over, was so successful that within 20 years the lord's property rights in serfdom were all but gone. Stolen. It was this theft of the lord's rights over their peasants that was the single most important factor in the giant next step in England's economic development, the transition from feudalism to capitalism. The single most important. That will be on the quiz. The creative genius of these now free farmers generated surges in agricultural production that gave the merchants more stuff to trade, driving the growth of cities, manufacturing, commerce, and powering England's rise into the 1500s and beyond. And besides, you can't have workers in factories if all the labor is tied to the land. Now, we must give credit where credit is due. the feudal lords themselves contributed to overthrowing feudalism. Just as soon as they got back from their 100-year holiday in France, they went at each other's throats. In the Wars of the Roses, 32 years of civil war, the various aristocratic gangs battled over the constitutional question of who would be crowned bandit-in-chief. They caused unspeakable misery for the people of England, but also performed the historically progressive act of killing each other off, helping to remove the obstacle of feudalism. It was so much easier for serfs to escape if their rightful lords were lying dead on the battlefield. Despite having the law, church, God's will, and armored knights on their side, individual aristocratic families just were not very good at holding on to their property over time. They squandered it, wasted it in war, feasted it away, willed it to spendthrift brats, or frittered so much time raping the village women that they forgot to sleep with their own wives and beget heirs. But the church knew how to save. The clergy, not allowed to marry, could not beget legitimate heirs, and their swarms of little bastards could not inherit. Nuns were kept under lock and key to help them focus on their service to the church rather than on the more pleasurable parts of their anatomy, as the male clerics did. Although Boccaccio and Robin Hood assure us that nuns too found ways to slip the chains of chastity. This kept all the property in the hands of the church, whose wealth grew and grew. Furthermore, the clergy assured the faithful that God could be bribed. So donating their property to his pious clergy improved their chances of entering heaven, even after a lifetime of depraved debauchery, further adding to the church's pile of loot. As Christopher Columbus gushed while plundering Jamaica, quote, "Gold is most excellent. With gold people amass a treasure. He who possesses it does what he wants in this world and can even raise souls into paradise." End quote. Remember we said the king owned every square inch of England? Actually, that's not true. The Roman Catholic Church in England had its own territory, controlling vast amounts of land and movable wealth. It claimed that its members were subject not to the law of the land, nor the monarch in London, but to the one in Rome. It maintained its own courts, which allowed its criminous foot soldiers, the clergy, to run riot. Through religious ideology, the church commanded influence far beyond its numbers in every city, town, village, home, and head. It was a state within the state, an obstacle to the formation of a unified English nation, a beachhead for Rome's ongoing drive to dominate the island, a project begun by Julius Caesar and pursued energetically by the popes. In 1530, the church made a power play, asserting authority over the king himself, which meant over the entire realm. King Henry VIII settled the dispute by stealing all the church's property, its monasteries, mounds of silver and gold plate, jewels, fabulous tapestries, fully 1/4 of England's cultivated land, the tremendous fortune these clerics had amassed to ease their vow of poverty. Fortunately, this loot did not just pass from the dead hand of the church to the dead hand of the state. Henry was too profligate at making wars to plunder France to hang on to this contraband. So in very short order, he gave away or sold virtually all of it, throwing it onto the growing capitalist market. While he was at it, he arrested the Pope's man in England, Thomas More, and cut off his head. Henry's murder of More and the obliteration of the Catholic Church, its property rights, and its legal privileges accomplished 4 important tasks. It destroyed the Roman Catholic Church as the biggest remaining feudal obstacle to the transition to capitalism in England, eliminated Imperial Rome's beachhead, primed the economic pump with the resulting loot, and consolidated England as an independent, unified nation-state. Now the king owned every square inch of the island. The farmers had taken the key step in undermining the feudal order by stealing their freedom from their rightful lords and weakening the feudal chains on the land. Then the lords all but wiped each other out, and Henry did his bit by shattering the largest remaining feudal power in England. But Henry's strength and political success put the monarchy back on the road toward despotism, so there remained some mopping up to do, including the annoying divine right of kings that James I and Charles I just would not stop harping on. Right after King James finished rewriting the Bible, he proclaimed, quote, "The state of monarchy is the supremest thing on earth, for kings are not only God's lieutenants on earth, but even by God himself they are called gods." Wow, by God himself? And you thought Christianity was monotheistic. Unfortunately for Charles, not enough Englishmen, and even fewer women, agreed with God on this matter, so another civil war ensued, in which the sturdy yeoman farmers played the critical role in the parliamentary army's victory. Oliver Cromwell led the revolution against monarchical despotism in England, stealing much royalist and church land in the process. Then he crushed an uprising by the Irish and imposed despotism there, stealing 2/3 of their land. These two colossal thefts advanced England's economic power, and not so much the Irish. This great advance in England's political and economic development was accomplished not by respecting Charles's personal, royal, divine, or property rights, but by chopping off his head. The merchants and landlords who profited from the thievery of the English Revolution showed their gratitude for the critical assistance of the farmer soldiers in the war by confiscating their farms. Yes, they called this enclosure. Stealing the property and destroying the rights of both the feudal landlords and the smallholders were essential steps in the transition from feudalism to capitalism. Vast amounts of land were snatched from small farmers and bestowed on great landlords, who replaced the farmers with sheep. This robbery produced mountains of wool for England's burgeoning textile industry. The governments helped clear farmers off their land, forcibly transforming them into vagabonds, and then hanged tens of thousands of them for the crime of being vagabonds. Of course, only poor people who did no work were called vagabonds. Rich people who did no work were called nobles. The lash of this grim school transformed the survivors into disciplined workers to toil in the growing textile mills, again driving England's economic expansion. The landlords got rich selling wool grown on their stolen land, and in the factories the new capitalists got very rich indeed, stealing most of the wealth that their mill hands produced, converting the wool into cloth. They called this profit. In the early years, conditions could be harsh. Workdays of 18 hours were very profitable. But in 1833, enlightened members of Parliament confiscated without due compensation a chunk of the factory owner's profits by banning child labor. Yeah, for longer than 12 hours a day, and except in certain industries, of course, where tossing the little ones into the machinery was still very lucrative. Horrified professional economists proclaimed that this government bureaucratic interference in the market and uncompensated expropriation of the profits of child labor would lead to the downfall of free enterprise. Alas, this did not happen. Yet. Great strides in England's advance next came from stealing entire continents from their inhabitants. First Ireland, and then North America, India, Australia, much of Africa, including Egypt, and many smaller bits all over the world. This global plunder showered a few in England with gold. Quote, the treasures captured outside England, Europe by undisguised looting, enslavement, and murder flowed back to the mother country and were turned into capital there. End quote. There were a few bumps in the road, however. In a part of North America, ungrateful subjects robbed the king of 13 of his colonies that he had just stolen from the Indians. This outrageous double theft laid the firm foundation for that new country's rise to world domination. With this small exception, the English did build quite an empire. They remembered what the Romans had taught them. First, reduce the natives to servitude and plunder the place, then unite them in common hatred against the conquerors. This contributed to building nations. The arrival by force and the forced departure of the English colonialism often advanced things, but both were based on obliterating existing rights, not respecting them. Quote, in actual history, it is a notorious fact that conquest, enslavement, robbery, murder, in short, force play the greatest part. End quote. Genocide and expulsion of native people from the southern United States cleared the way for cotton plantations in the 1700s and 1800s. To ensure an adequate workforce, Britain had provided free transportation to the New World for 3.1 million Africans stolen from their homes, of whom 400,000 failed to arrive. To labor on these plantations to supply British mills. Many Irish and Scots were also sent. Genocide and chattel and wage slavery, not reverent respect for property rights, powered England's explosive economic expansion at this stage. Today's servile adulation for the private property rights of the elite, pontificated by venal high priests of economics departments everywhere, has only worsened Britain's current stagnation and decline. It's become downright embarrassing. Britain's empire was a misfortune that retarded its subsequent development at home. Clearly, another major theft, that is, revolution, is long overdue. At the other end of the Roman Empire, Emperor Constantine had moved the capital to Constantinople in 330 to shield his belongings from those nasty Northern European barbarians. There, in contrast to England, the ruler's property rights were protected with a vengeance. The result of this successful defense of property rights is that the word Byzantine is now synonymous with stagnation, passing over into putrefaction for 1,000 years. What made England different from Byzantium was that in the latter, as in ancient Egypt before it, the ruling elite was able to crush the class struggle, whereas in England, the conflict raged on, driving the country forward. This brief tour shows that fetishizing private property rights does not really explain England's early economic success. Indeed, it would be difficult to find a country where property rights have so often and so thoroughly been shredded. Engels pointed out, quote, all revolutions to date have been revolutions for the protection of one kind of property against another kind of property. They cannot protect one kind without violating another. And indeed, the object of all so-called political revolutions, from the first to the last, was to protect one kind of property by confiscating, also called stealing, another kind of property. This is so true that for the last 2,500 years, it has been possible to maintain private property only by violating property rights. End quote. Today's professorial high priests of the sanctity of private property rights always leave out the fact that the Roman slaveholders, the feudal landlords, and the capitalists have always been the biggest violators of the property rights of others, as their wealth comes from appropriating the property of the vast majority of the population. Highlighting this history of revolution is necessary to rebut the gospel that venerating private property rights is the key to economic growth. Focusing exclusively on England's many revolutions, however, presents a picture that is just as one-sided as, but no more than, that hustled by academics. In fact, between the upheavals, yesterday's thieves, today's ruling elites, did all they could to make sure that their newly established property rights and their freshly stolen wealth were devoutly observed. And it is true that these stable periods, too, were essential for economic growth. The gains of the previous revolution needed to be consolidated and new social classes develop that would, in their turn, overthrow the existing property relations when they grew rancid. Whenever those property rights, that manner of organizing society, and that economy all turned stale and became an obstacle to the next stage of economic expansion, another revolution became necessary. England's genius, thus, was not fawning adulation for the property rights of the rich, but alternating between uprising and stability at a tempo that kept things moving forward, at least until recently. Oh, look at the time. I have to stop here, although this is only half of my brief history of England. But you can find the rest and more in these books: The Power of Peasants, Economics and Politics of Farming in Medieval Germany, and an excerpt from it, published separately, A Brief History of England. Another excerpt, The Malthus Fraud, is also very interesting. Now, you might be wondering, what is A Brief History of England doing in a rather long history of medieval agriculture in Germany? Well, I'm not going to tell you. You'll just have to read the book. But I can promise you that the rest of it is just as much fun as this part. In my opinion, at least. Thank you.